Everybody. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining today's sponsored webinar on celiac disease. I'm Vahe Badalian from Children's National Medical Center, and I'll be the moderator today. We have wonderful speakers today that will be talking about building a center with capacity for clinical trials. I want to thank Takeda for sponsoring this webinar series. I will now introduce our speakers while I'm also sharing my slides here. So our speakers include today Dr. Dawn Adams, who is an associate professor of medicine at Vanderbilt University Medical Center. Dr. Adams specializes in small bowel disorders, nutrition support, intestinal failure, and celiac disease. She also directs the Vanderbilt Center Celiac Clinic and also the Center for Human Nutrition. She also leads their parenteral nutrition and home infusion programs and serves as the president of the Society for the Study of Celiac Disease. So before I introduce our next speaker, let me see if I can share this with you. Here we go. Okay. Our next speaker is Dr. Ed Loop, who is a pediatric gastroenterologist and director of the Colorado Center for Celiac Disease. Dr. Loop's expertise lies in celiac disease screening, serology, and epidemiology, especially in type 1 diabetes. He is also part of the NASPGHAN Celiac Disease Special Interest Group. Dr. Loop also serves on the board of directors for the International Society for the Study of Celiac Disease, working to expand international collaboration in pediatric celiac disease research. And my third speaker today is Dr. Brian Hollis, who is a medical director at Quality Clinical Research, which is a research network. He is also a board-certified internal medicine physician with extensive experience leading clinical trials across multiple therapeutic areas. As a certified principal investigator, he is also involved in training future clinical research professionals and works closely with patients throughout the research process. And the brief mention of how to claim CME credits today, you can either send a text to the number listed here, 459242, or the full phone number from a mobile number that's associated with your account. You will receive a confirmation code once your credits have been awarded. And we will bring up CME information again at the end of this talk for those people that join later. So with that, without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing my slides and invite our first speaker with their presentation. Thank you.
Dr. Hollis, did you want to go first? You're on mute.
That would be great if we could. I'm on two separate
We were
calls.
budgeting for you to go first, but go ahead.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Let's see. Let's see if I can get my screen to share. I'll give Haley. Sorry, guys. I'll just give background on myself. Thanks for the introduction. Brian Hollis, Medical Director of Quality Clinical Research. I work as a hospitalist generally, certifications as a certified principal investigator and board of obesity medicine. So I was asked to kind of share sort of some of the processes and what it takes to be involved in clinical trials as a non-academic based site or research network, and particularly how it is can be done so for a celiac trial or population. So I guess first off, I joined the organization after it had been formed. I started with COVID doing inpatient hospitalist-based trials, and then have proceeded from there to become more involved in the day-to-day. And over the last few years, have been involved in, as the director of a number of sites, and much more involved in day-to-day activities, including operations. Um, so there was a lot of legwork and a lot of, the organization was already functioning before I was involved with it. Um, but for starting processes, obviously you need a site, and from there you need to determine whether you are affiliated as a clinic or a physician provider group. So a lot of people do this involved with their own practices or a standalone site. And so like our group of networks are standalone sites. We're research based only. And so I don't have like a patient panel that I refer to specifically. With that, there are recruitment efforts to establish a database of patients that you refer from, as well as community outreach. And for this particularly subgroup, we did a lot of outreach to like gluten-free bakeries, to dietitians, to any sort of organization that we thought would help maybe refer or gain interest from patient population. Um, for celiac studies itself, and particularly the one we did, there are a few issues that are ones that need to be considered before attempting the trial, or to ensure that a site is capable of doing so. The most important is, making sure you have the capabilities of performing the site, um, making sure that you feel like you have patients that you're able to recruit or involve in the trial. And then operationally, there are a lot of aspects, particularly in the one that we performed or the ones that we've looked at, that are more labor intensive than in other sort of modalities. So for us, gastroenterology, we have one sub-investigator that's a gastroenterologist, and we have a group that I work with at the hospital. And so we have arranged the ability for endoscopies to be done through their site and their facility, but there were transport issues with biopsies and getting them from specimen collection to the sponsor and the CRO for those purposes. There is the aspect of these visits take longer and infusions take longer. And so we needed pharmacists as well as nursing staff that we don't always employ. We sort of contract them on a study to study basis as they're required. And then the time frame that the participants needed to participate. So their visits took 5 or 6 hours at a time. So it took up their day and our staff's time, and we would get gluten-free lunches for them and our staff members generally, and basically do all we could to accommodate their issues and needs while participating. Um, Sorry, very brief kind of overview and sort of like low-level discussion of some of the nuts and bolts of what it entails to do, clinical trials, but on a non-academic site. Hopefully that provides a little bit of insight. Certainly free to answer a few questions if they may come up of, what it really means like on a day-to-day basis, or how did we functionally do this. But those are what my slides pretty much had in them. So I'll leave, I guess, that for questions or any other issues that may have been brought up.
So
Thank
Brian,
you very much.
I was gonna ask a question. You like already walked into infrastructure that was set up to do clinical research. Do you know of any like smaller groups that are doing like specifically possibly with BGI, or just like smaller groups that are kind of doing research on their own, not necessarily as part of a big research infrastructure as you have, and how that looks? Do you
Yeah,
interact with them?
yeah, yeah, there are a few scattered like family practice or internal med offices around town that have their own setups. They typically tend to do like lower volumes, and they tend to have like better success probably on more sort of broadly based like trials. So vaccines, obesity, those sort of things may be better for them than a trial that has the specific needs of, say, like the celiac trial. So they exist. They they do not have the infrastructure of like a business development service, or they don't have necessarily the capacity that I do to recruit other adjacent staff that is required like immediately. If we need a pharmacist, if we need a GI doc, if we need nursing staff, I can go to the hospital and talk to whoever I need to kind of right away. So I think those sites have a little bit more of a challenge in general to do sort of more like more concentrated or more focused trials and maybe do better on general stuff. But they certainly exist and they find their manners on where they can thrive and do their best to participate in trials as well.
Sounds like Dr. Liu has a question.
Yeah, thanks, Brian, for your perspective. I'm curious, so the patients that you recruit for these trials, are they typically from your own patient base, or are there patients from outside your practice that are like hearing about the trials and then asked to be enrolled? How's that look?
They're both. So our database, I mean, Omaha's a big city. We have, probably 20,000-ish people on our database, and that continues to grow with the outreach events and those sort of things. So what happens, there's a combination of that. That's usually about 2/3 of the participants or somebody that's been done something in the past. Now, for instance, for the celiac, that wasn't the case, right? A lot of them would be either not qualified for other participating in different trials or haven't previously. We had some referrals from the Celiac Foundation, but a lot of this, the other third of our enrollees or participants usually comes from some sort of social media marketing campaign. Usually Facebook, Instagram, TikTok. Our marketing department focuses on those, and they utilize that to boost our database, boost the interest, and also target specific communities for people. So, for instance, they would focus like the Omaha Celiac group. And then send something to them, or we reach out to them. And so that further hopefully gets people interested. Now, the difference for us with celiac versus other sort of comorbidities or other trials is the celiac participants really wanted to do so from like an altruistic standpoint. They all wanted to help those with their underlying condition, right? And we didn't get the people that are coming to like get a paycheck or were like necessarily wanting the therapeutic benefit of what they were receiving. So the participants obviously were hopeful for that, but they really wanted to help. And that's why these people were showing up.
Can I ask another
Dr.
question?
Hollis? Yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah, go for it.
Dr. Go ahead. You first, go ahead.
I was just curious how quickly you can get a trial. Like, so you find you want to do a trial. How quickly can you get it to action? Because I have a feeling it's probably way quicker than I'm going to talk about.
It's much more streamlined process than what would happen at an academic center. So I work at a community-based hospital, so I've been outside of a residency program for 13 years now. But so first, I mean, stage-wise, we would get the feasibility. Our business development team would do that. Then we're contacted about like, a site qualification visit. And once we're approved for a trial, we can have budget, we can have templates, we can have IRB approval in the matter of generally a few weeks, which is, I imagine, much easier process than what some of you guys go through.
Yeah, Dr. Hollis, my question was kind of along the same vein. There's probably a lot of small practices around the country and not near where the large tertiary centers are. And I imagine for those smaller practices, even if there's a desire to do research or participate in those trials, the tasks may be very daunting, meeting the regulatory requirements or setting up databases and having staff available to help. What would you advise these center or these practices that are thinking about it but not ready to make the first step?
Yeah, I mean, my advisement to them would be, at first it would, to be honest, it would be dependent on what their motives are for doing the clinical research, right? If they're doing it as a method to keep their clinic afloat because they're not affiliated with a medical center and they need income, then the answer is to try to do it all themselves. But if I was starting my own and I had a practice, what I would do is I would partner with a CRO, and then try to get in line with them and to utilize their contacts to start getting a trial pipeline, to utilize their resources to get the studies easier in that manner. Because otherwise, I think a study that was doing it on their own would become overwhelmed with the complications of all the stuff behind the scenes and probably get frustrated with how long it takes to get started and may not even get off the ground due to the difficulties that are inherent of an infrastructure process. So I think it's something that probably anybody can do, but you have to have the patience and the wherewithal and the desire really to do so, to do it well. And I think a lot of those places probably, unfortunately are sort of in this like gray zone where they want to do it, but don't really know how to do it to scale that makes a big difference for their practice or their patients, or like trying to provide, because we all want to do it to provide options for treatments for our patients they may not have otherwise, or that's what a lot of us do it for, right? And they may never get to that stage if they're struggling with the startup processes. So my answer would be to get in line with somebody that knows what they're doing to help them get trials to get their foot in the door.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions? I don't see any in the chat. So thank you very much, Dr. Hollis. We can
Great.
move on to our next speaker.
Thank you, guys. Thanks for listening. Hopefully that helped answer a few questions. If anybody has any questions, email me. I would be very responsive to getting back with issues.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yep. Bye, guys. Thank you. Thank you for letting me go first too. Bye.
Bye-bye. So our next speaker, who wants to go next? Dr. Adams?
I think I was going to go next. Okay,
Okay.
I'll share hopefully I can share my screen. Let's see. Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. And you can see the presenter view, not the other view. Okay.
That's right.
My perspective is that I'm coming from a large academic center, and primarily I'm an adult gastroenterologist. I'm dealing with adult clinical trials. And I kind of started like 101 because when I started my celiac center, I didn't really know anything about how clinical trials work at an academic center and who is who. So I'm taking a very like basic 101 step here. And so hopefully this will be helpful for some people. If you do a lot of trials, this might seem a little bit redundant, but I have found that it took me several years to really understand the pieces parts. And I have a lot of really cheesy stock images that I put into this presentation, so please enjoy those. So the first thing is just like, what are you thinking about when you're setting up clinical trials? And I think it's really important to know that it's really complex and regulated. And it's to ensure participant safety and that we're getting good, reliable data. So there's a reason for it. So when you're frustrated, you just have to think, this is why we're doing it. There are so many different people, at least from the academic side, that are involved in a clinical trial, and I'm going to go over who those people are. And then what are you trying to do? You're trying to get your scientific question into reliable data, and that's where we're going with this. So I think that the biggest thing for me with doing trials, and part of that might just be the infrastructure I'm involved in, is that you really, I think, need to be passionate and have a need. So I felt like this girl seemed to be a passionate leader of her young girls here, is why I picked this picture. But I think for me particularly, like I do celiac disease, obviously, and there's no drugs available. And I also take care of short bowel syndrome, and there's very minimal treatments available for both those diseases. And I feel really motivated. Like I want to help my patients get a medication. And so that's why I personally have taken the time to try to bring clinical trials to our center. Our center, our Vanderbilt, doesn't necessarily give support for clinical trials like they do for people that are participating in NIH-sponsored trials or federal trials. And so what does that mean? I think if you're considering doing clinical trials, you want to ask your institution, how am I going to get compensated for clinical trials? And am I going to get compensated for clinical trials? You may or may not. And just what does your institution think about clinical trials, and how do they value that in the structure of promotion, pay, all the things that matter when you're at academic center. And then patients, do you have the patients? Are these people that are coming through you or your partners? How are you going to get the patients specifically to your clinic so you can recruit them? And can this help you bring in more patients? It might also be that by you having clinical trials, you might get more referrals and get more of that patient population. I think this happens in celiac disease. I think this is a good way that I've found people that are either not following up at all for celiac disease, or maybe are seeing their primary care, or maybe talk to a GI doctor one time a year and get a scope, which probably isn't even indicated. They get recruited through clinical trials, and then they end up becoming your patients because they realize that you have a whole center. So there might be a motivation to do that as well. So just going over, I was going to take a few minutes to go over who is who, at least who I think who is who in an academic center with clinical trials. So if you are the PI, that's usually the physician, that's what I serve. You are essentially responsible for everything, and that's what you'll learn through your clinical trial training, your GCP training, and that ultimately comes down to the PI. And so you have to make sure that you know what's going on and the leadership you're providing to your site team, but as well as interacting with the people off of your site. And so that's why it's a lot of work. I do feel like it takes up a lot of time. And so you need to identify clearly, how your institution is going to support you, and if you really want to do this, and what is your benefit. I think the principal investigator also supervises and documents, and there's a lot of signatures. So be ready for constantly going over various sheets, signing, making sure labs are okay, that all your staff are on task. You're going to constantly be getting pages and pages of signatures that you have to be accountable for. It's also important as the PI that you're enrolling the right patients. And if you're doing multiple studies, sometimes it can get confusing. So something that I found helpful when we have several studies going on is I like to make these little cheat sheets. Like, you'll get these protocols for clinical trials and they're very long, and it's nice just to have a snapshot. And I really like when the sponsor or the CRO provides those, and many times they don't. It's just like inclusion, exclusion, like how long is the study in celiac? Are they getting gluten? Are they getting scope? Just like really highlighted cheat sheets that you can have around your clinic to remind you, and also some of your other staff that I'll get to. And as I mentioned, it all comes down to the PI. So there is a lot of responsibility for the PI. So really making sure that you are invested in doing these trials. For me, this is really important as co-investigators and sub-investigators. So as a gastroenterologist, I'm very busy and I'm in endoscopy or I'm working off-site. And so I'm not always on main campus where our clinical trials are happening when the patients are there. And so it's really helpful that I have a team of other doctors or PAs or nurse practitioners who may be on the trials with me, and they can provide a lot of the support. So they can see the patients, they can help triage if there's an urgent event. And I think it's also really important that they can help be flexible, because if a patient's in a clinical trial, you need to work a lot around their schedule and also the very strict schedules of clinical trials. So they have specific windows when you can come in for screening, a specific window when day one visit is, when the second visit is. And if you're the only person that can be seeing these patients and doing the exams, it's probably not going to work that well, because it's just not a realistic setup. And so it's really helpful, I think, to have other people on the trial with you. So your clinical research coordinators, this might work differently at different institutions. Ours are a combination of research assistants or research nurses, and it varies based on what are the needs of the study. So if the study has a lot of infusions or injections that needs a nurse or some nurse education, that would be more appropriate for a nurse. If not, might be more appropriate for a research assistant. If you're building a center, a research assistant's going to be less expensive than a nurse typically. And so a lot of times that might be a way to get yourself up and running, and could use a clinical nurse for certain specific activities, but have the actual research coordinator be a research assistant. And so you would definitely need to hire someone to serve this role. This person's important for many different things. And again, this might vary based on institution, but here our CRCs do manage recruitment, they obtain the consent, and they also do all the study visit coordination, data entry. And the biggest thing for the CRCs, I think, is communication with the patient. So they are constantly talking to the patients. They're also constantly talking to the sponsors, the monitor, and the investigator. They're really the one that is doing most of the communication and kind of linking you to all these different things. So you have to have a great relationship with these people and really, really talk to them regularly and trust them. So this is where things may differ a little bit, but if you're at an academic institution, you have some type of regulatory coordinators, and this comes from the academic side. Some of these activities in certain centers may actually fall on the clinical research coordinators, which adds another layer of work to what they have to do. At our institution, we have a separate team of regulatory, so our clinical research coordinators are not focused on the regulatory side, which is nice, and it frees up some time for them to spend recruiting and talking to the patients. I'm not going to go through everything that I listed here, but these are all the things that the regulatory side is doing. And again, this is on the side of the academic side. So this is your institution's regulatory board, and there's also regulatory on the side of the sponsor, the non-academic side. Regulatory can take a long time. So to get through regulatory and contracts and all of that, on average, our institution unfortunately quotes somewhere between 3 and 4 months. That's why I asked Dr. Hollis, like he said 2 weeks. I'm very envious of that, because what happens a lot of time is you get a clinical trial up and you get excited, and then it's months and months pass and you're like, where are we at with this clinical trial? And then your IRB and ethics committee, also, again, this is on the institutional side. So you may have what's called a central IRB for a study, or an institutional IRB. And so one thing to ask your institution is, do they allow central IRBs? Central IRBs are a great way for clinical trials that have multiple centers to have just one IRB and get everything through very quickly. Unfortunately, my institution does not accept central IRBs unless it's an NIH or federal funded study. And so we have to do individual site IRBs. And so finding out what your institution allows is definitely helpful. The individual site IRBs are a little bit higher of a fee for the sponsor, because the IRBs do have a fee, and then it also takes a little bit more time. Okay, so who's out? That's all the people that are at your academic center that you're working with directly. And then who's outside? So again, this might be just review for everyone, but I think it's good to remember like what the roles are when you're talking to people. And these are things I didn't know when I first started doing trials. So who's the sponsor? The sponsor is the company that is initiating, managing, financing the clinical trial. So your pharma or your biotech is the sponsor, and they actually own the product and do bear ultimate regulatory and legal responsibility. They're usually the ones that are funding the trials and making strategic decisions. And so on a day-to-day basis, when you're doing clinical trials, you're not having that much interaction with the sponsor. You're mostly working with the contract research organizations, or the CROs, is what everyone calls them. So this is how most clinical trials work now, and most of the ones that I participated in have all had a CRO. So this is a third-party company that's hired by the sponsor. These are some of the big ones listed here that you may have worked with if you've done a clinical trial, or you might see if you start doing clinical trials. And so these are kind of like the go-between the sponsor and the site. And so this is what they do for a business. They help run clinical trials. And so they've tried to streamline a lot of the processes to make it easier for the sponsors to get a clinical trial to the center. So when you're thinking about your center, you want to, ask around, like, I want to start doing clinical trials, how does it work with CROs? How does our team usually interact with them? And what's that relationship going to be like? Then the CROs also have their own CRAs, and these are the people that will actually be coming onto your site many times and interacting with your clinical research assistant directly. And these are the monitors as well. So they'll come, they'll do visits at site initiation, routine monitoring visits, and closeout visits. So again, if you're thinking about starting a center, these are things you're going to have to be involved in as the PI occasionally. You have to be at the site visit and the closeout visit, and then they do want to occasionally see you during some of the routine monitoring visits. They're mostly going to be working, again, with your clinical research assistant or your clinical nurse, and they are very heavily involved in the trial on a day-to-day basis. And then again, I mentioned there's also regulatory side from the non-academic side, and they're doing just complementing what's being done in the academic institution to make sure that everything is being followed appropriate by all of the compliance and management strategies that are required for clinical trial. You also will have a data management, safety, and statistics team. Again, this is outside your institution, and they will be monitoring data and intermittent analysis, and they'll be working with the CRA to occasionally talk to you about issues or problems that are happening with the study. Okay, so just a couple more slides I wanted to add for if you're starting a center, things to think about is how are you finding your patients? Some things that I've learned and could be helpful. As Dr. Hollis mentioned, I think Dr. Liu might also talk about this as well. It can help to have a good database of patients that are interested in trials or just database of all your patients. For celiac disease, I've found particularly things, I'm still trying to, fix our database to make it easier as I learn going through these trials. But I think it's helpful to have some specific points, like were they biopsy proven? Do they have constant symptoms? Do they have an HLA? Because these are things that a lot of the trials are filtering out. So you could easily create a list of people that meet your criteria. That being said, if you're thinking about starting a database, it's a lot of work. So who's going to do that? And so if you want to, make this, think about the maintenance of the database, how you're going to enter patients and who's going to keep up with it. Other things you can do if you have everyone has an EMR, we use Epic, is that we just have a huge Epic list of patients with celiac disease and other diseases that we care for. And so sometimes we can just go through and screen. Now those lists can get very large. Our celiac list is over 1,000, for example. But you can filter these, and there's some new things, at least that we're seeing at Vanderbilt. I'm sure this exists other places with AI, where you can do specific, you can try specific types of questions. This is something they're working on right now to try to filter out patients and find patients for that. I think it's important also to talk directly with your patients, and this can even lead to the database. This might be how you add them. But if you have a clinic with a lot of different people seeing patients, talk with them, like your dietitians, and we use a lot of advanced practice providers. They get to spend more time with the patients than I do. And so I need to make sure that they're educated on the clinical trials that we're doing and that exist, and that they talk to patients about, are you ever interested in clinical trials? Because they're the ones that are getting a lot of face time with the patients. Also, specifically with celiac disease, you might talk to your patient and you might actually, they might not be interested, but they have a lot of family members that have celiac disease. And so I think it's an opportunity just to educate what's happening, and they might end up telling their family member, who then says, oh, I would be interested in that. As Dr. Hollis also mentioned, we do try to do some advertisements. I think if you're at an academic institution, it's a little bit more limited. Obviously, any advertisement you do for clinical trial has to be approved by the IRB. We specifically do advertise with Signs in Clinic. We also have an Instagram that we can advertise certain things, but not other, pending IRB approval, patient newsletter, and then we add events. And another thing is talking to your colleagues. So how is your center set up? Do you see all the celiac disease patients, or are they kind of spread out and they only sometimes come to you? If they're spread out, you need to talk to your colleagues. Hey, I'm doing trials. Like, send the patients to me if they're interested in trial, or send them to me anyways, because we can talk about trial. If you have satellite institutions that are, part of your bigger institution, you might also want to educate the people at the satellite place that you are setting up a center to do clinical trials, so to please send patients with celiac disease to your center. And then external referrals. Actually was talking about this with someone at DDW, that celiac trials have a very high percentage of enrollment coming from external referrals, like Celiac Disease Foundation or Beyond Celiac. And so these are different ways where you might get a patient advocacy group to send patients to you. So as I mentioned, they're just out in the community. They see through these advocacy groups that it exists, and then you can get the patients through the trial that way. And so think about if you're going to accept external referrals and what that will look like. Do you need the patient to establish with you? Are you willing just to see them as part of the trial without, an established visit? You do have to go through their records, make sure they qualify, because it's ultimately, again, up to you as the PI. And then my last slide is just how do you get trials? What trials should you pick? I think a part of this is networking and letting others in the field know you're interested in celiac clinical trials or whatever clinical trial you're doing, and that you have the infrastructure for it. You can meet with different companies at conferences, network through other people in the field that are doing clinical trials. I think once you start doing a few clinical trials, it seems like, oh, then more keep coming to you because they know that you've done these in the past. And these CROs, they help also find sites, and they know like who has these populations and who can do them. As I've alluded to, really, like, what is your institutional capacity? So think about that. Do you have everything you need? Do you have the patient population? For some of the trials, does it need to be done in a clinical research center? Do you have that? Are you staffed for this trial? And do you think you can recruit for it? Because you never want to sign up for a trial and then realize I can't get any patients in it, or I just don't have the manpower to get me the patients I need. And then timeline, and this is a huge issue for me, because sometimes by the time you start negotiations when you're at academic center and like 4 or 5 months pass and they finally say, okay, you can enroll a patient, you then learned, oh, they just enrolled their last patient and the study is closing. So I have learned this the hard way, that I need to ask when we first start talking, when does enrollment end? And if it's not 6 months or greater, we typically won't go through with trying to get that trial pushed through because of all the paperwork it takes just to get it approved. Okay, and that is all I have.
Thank you very much, Dr. Adams. This was a terrific overview. Lots of ground covered. I have a couple questions while other folks are thinking of their own. You said that you started this basically from zero, essentially. And you mentioned that as a busy clinician, you have to rely a lot on the clinical research coordinator. So when you were doing your first few studies, did the institution invest in the CRCs, or did you have to get it sort of covered within the budget set by the sponsor?
I'm sorry, for a second, I lost what you said, just the very end of the question.
Yeah, who was covering the expenses associated with the CRC? Was it the institution or was it the sponsor in your first few?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Trials?
So when you negotiate your contracts, they'll usually cover a certain percentage of a clinical research assistant. That isn't always, though, a full-time person, right? And so I was lucky that at my institution, we do have within the GI group a research team. And so I was able to utilize some of the research assistants that already existed for other disease states to get us started. But we do constantly have to justify our staff by actually bringing in money for the trials. So if you don't bring in money for the trials and if you don't enroll patients, then you don't get as much payment to the institution, and then there isn't the resources to pay the staff to help you run the trial. And so it's important to make sure when you're looking at the budgets, and this is something, again, that I don't personally do because my institution has the expertise with this, that the budget seems appropriate for the amount of work it's going to be for the clinical research assistant and the compensation that's budgeted for that specific activity.
Thank you. Dr. Liu, I think, has a question.
Yeah, thanks, Don. This is really helpful for someone who hasn't been involved actually in any clinical trials to hear this. It's tragic when you put in all this work to enroll patients and then they're done, you don't enroll anyone. Like, do you typically embed in your budget, like, not per patient, but the work it takes to set things up from the start, so that if you end up not recruiting anybody, then at least you get compensated for that time?
Yeah, there is some things that are just standard fees, like, for example, the IRB fees and the contract fees and the setup fees, and those are going to be billed regardless of whether or not you enroll a patient. For me, in my time, again, this is something to find out from your institution. I personally don't get any compensation for the trials, so it's more because I feel passionate about it and want to enroll the patient. So it doesn't matter for me one way or another, but it does matter for the institution if you don't enroll any.
Dr. Adams, for recruiting the patients, do you feel it would be easy to set up sort of a distribution list, or maybe have them opt in to receive frequent communications from your the institution about anything, including the trials?
Yeah, I think that's a great idea, and I think big centers do that. We have a newsletter that we send out quarterly, and then we put in there what trials we're enrolling for. That way it hits people that haven't even expressed interest in clinical trials before, because you also never know with celiac disease. I think people might change their opinion on when they're ready to participate in a trial. You know, like a newly diagnosed celiac disease, to talk to them about clinical trials, it's a little overwhelming right away. And then maybe they'd say no. And so if there's a way that you can just mass communicate through something like a newsletter, we also use Instagram. I think separately, also having a list of people that want to receive notification every time there's a trial is another interesting thing. We don't personally do that, but I think that's a good idea if you can set up your database to do that.
Thank you. All right. Let's see. We have no further questions for Dr. Adams. Thank you again, Dr. Adams. I think Dr. Liu.
Wait, one more quick question, because I'm just stalling so I don't have to talk. But I'll get started right after this. So, I wonder, so when you have other partners that are also seeing patients that may be eligible for trials, that becomes a challenge, right? I mean, ideally, we'd like to see 100% of all these patients with celiac disease, but the reality is it's not possible. And how big of a barrier do you think that is? Like, is this like a major missed opportunity?
You mean that my partners are seeing them and not talking to them about celiac disease?
Yes.
Yeah, I do. I try to like when I do my GI grand rounds, I always bring up we're doing clinical trials, like remember, send patients to us. But I do think that, especially with how hospital systems are working, and like at least where I'm at, we're buying up all these other hospitals, and people think they're going to see a Vanderbilt GI doctor, but I never have any interaction with those people, you know, because they're in a different city. And so how to really communicate, like getting that clinical trials exist to everyone that is within, you know, your institution's reach is I think a missed opportunity, and something we do try to work on through education, but I think you're still missing patients.
Thanks. I'm going to get started now. How's that sound?
That sounds good. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Hope you can see this. Do you see like the real presentation, not like this is okay?
Yes. Yes,
All right,
it's good.
All right. Thanks, guys, for the opportunity. I'm going to give you the pediatric perspective for building a center with capacity for clinical trials. And I'm glad Don gave you guys all the great details for actually doing a trial, because in reality, there are no pediatric patients enrolled in any clinical trials for celiac disease for drug therapy, right? And so I can give you sort of like the front end perspective of actually building a center that gives you the capacity and start to think about readiness for trials that would be coming up. So I think that the foundation for all of this is really clinical care, right? You need a really good infrastructure for clinical care. And that includes, for example, standardized pathways for diagnosis and management for your patients. You know, like when you have this sort of consistency from a clinical standpoint, and you also really set expectations to the patients from the start, I think it really helps with like patient engagement. And to give you an example, like, you know, having a structured follow-up can really be important. Okay. And what we do, for example, when we have a new diagnosis, we tell them from the beginning, like when we're doing the evaluation, okay, if you have celiac disease, 3 things are going to happen. You know, number 1, we're going to get you into the class, right? You'll learn about the gluten-free diet from a class. And there's also a behavioral health and wellness video that you can watch that helps. And the second thing is that we are going to follow up with you in 3 months for an appointment. And the third thing is we set up a joint assessment for a dietitian and the celiac psychologist review of the gluten-free diet afterwards. So those 3 things we set up from the beginning. And this is what you would expect if you get a diagnosis of celiac disease. And then when they do get the diagnosis, you know, we tell them, again, here are the 3 things that are your next steps. And we tell our scheduling, schedulers, okay, set them up for the celiac trifecta. get those appointments made right now for those three things. So these are the ways that really can help you maintain follow-up, because I think follow-up with your patients typically can be very, very low. And by having a structured follow-up where the families know, hey, I need to see you every year or every 2 years, that can start to help you again with recruitment in the future. Okay. The second part to this is having multidisciplinary expertise. You know, when you've got a clinical team, right? The clinical team is going to be your gastroenterologist and, of course, an expert dietitian. It can really help to have psychology support for this. It's very important to have pathologist alignment, and that can be challenging, and also nursing and coordination, right? But then outside your actual clinical team, you think about your referral sources. So, you know, really work closely with these groups, for example, endocrinology, because they're seeing these patients for short stature or thyroiditis, and they may end up diagnosing new cases of celiac disease for you. For sure, the type 1 diabetes programs, the trisomy 21 clinics, and of course, primary care, right? That's the biggest pool, but they're also so much more diluted. It can really help if you have coordinated adult and pediatric care, right? I think having both really, really helps you with the transition as well. And bonus would be if you actually have a collaborating research laboratory. And of course, a supportive philanthropic foundation is always very nice. By the way, these are AI babies, if you can't tell. So no babies were exploited in the making of this presentation. You know, the research operations, you know, what's your research team? And Donna talked about this as well, right? And this is including a regulatory specialist, which is very important, having a research coordinator, a database manager, a research nurse, and also someone who does the budget. A budget analyst is going to be very important for your team. So these are things you think about as you're trying to set up for clinical trials. Another thing that can be very helpful is having a registry and biorepository. So this helps you with, for example, longitudinal tracking of your patients. And it helps to be able to pull up data quickly. You know, so for example, you want to know like all children diagnosed within the past 6 weeks, or all adults with persistent villus atrophy after 1 year of a gluten-free diet. So being able to pull up this data quickly, it helps you attract collaborators and also it helps you run investigator-initiated studies, and all this stuff kind of helps demonstrate research readiness. Network integration and strategic identity. So, you know, when you build up your practice, right, when you first start like a celiac program or celiac center, you know, you start from within, right? You start with the internal referrals and you know, get your partners to send all the patients your way, you know. And I did mention before the infrastructure for clinical care. That's really important. And I really do believe that if you build it, they will come. So, you know, when we first started our celiac center, instead of just seeing patients, that's great. You see patients and you build up their internal referrals. But probably the one thing that really made us feel a little bit more structured was really just the start of having a celiac class, right? Just having a class where patients can get together. This is something that like other providers can refer to as well. And that becomes a way to start to centralize the care for all the patients with celiac disease who come towards your institution, and not just the ones that you see, but for other providers. So the class was probably the very first start that helped grow our group. Got to educate your referral base, right? The primary care doctors go around and make those rounds, and demonstrate that you have the capacity to see these patients. This is very important. So I would prioritize local referral accesses. So like when the PCPs need the patient to be seen, get them in within 2 to 3 weeks, right? Make a priority to get them in sooner. That way they will continue to send them to you. And of course, larger patient volumes means more research opportunities. Also, it helps define your niche, right? Like develop an expertise within your expertise. You know, our group, we really focus on screening right? General population screening and early diagnosis. And that happens to actually increase our population base as well. I think that Colorado probably is the most, heavily celiac disease scrutinized state in the country. We screen a lot of patients. Donate your time, right to the, the patient advocacy groups. Be available. I think that's very, very important to set up great relationship with local and national advocacy and support groups. Patient and community engagement. When you see patients, really start to develop that research culture in the clinic, right? Always talk to them about ongoing research. Here are the ongoing trials. Here's what's happening. And in that way, it can start to normalize participation. Even though there aren't any trials for us right now in pediatrics, it normalizes the participation. Educate your patients about what the trials involve, right? You have a registry, you have newsletters, you keep the community engaged with research, but it's also important to set realistic expectations. For example, hey, these trials are going to involve gluten. There's going to be a placebo arm. There's no guaranteed benefit, those kinds of things. It's important to get that trust. And probably also, a big factor in maybe patients being reluctant to join would be the risk of what they perceive as the risk of short-term gluten exposure. And I think it would be important for us as a group to really clarify the actual risks of short-term gluten exposure as opposed to, for example, long-term chronic exposure. So, it starts with clinical care, right? And it's rarely through the research first approach, right? Just by doing research in a lab or research in your practice, it isn't going to build that, right? It's really the clinical care part. And again, you start with the clinical infrastructure. That way you can start to increase referrals, you get larger patient volume, you develop the research capacity, you get academic visibility, and then you further broaden your referral network. And again, like, at the Jones Hospital, Colorado, we don't have an adult celiac disease center, but I think it really does help greatly to establish that relationship between adult and pediatric. So I hope this was helpful for you guys.
Thank you very much, Dr. Liu, for sharing the pediatric institution's perspective on clinical trials. I was wondering, with the patients that we see in their childhood, many of them still end up seeing us when they're 18, 19, 20, until they transition to an adult gastroenterologist. Is that subset of patients 18, 19, 20, do you think that's a good sort of a subgroup that you could potentially recruit into clinical trials and still have them done at your site?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think so, and maybe one of the challenges is like a lot of them are in college now, and whether or not they're able to participate becomes a challenge. But yeah, the young adults we can still capture, right? And I think it just depends on the volume, right? If you can show that you've got the volume, then you may be asked to participate in some of those early trials.
Dr. Liu, do you ever find that you might recruit like a parent who might be listening in, or there might be an opportunity there, since we don't have any trials for children yet, that might also have celiac disease?
We're coming from a perspective where like we don't have an adult celiac disease center, locally. And so like we are not even seeing any kind of spillover from that standpoint, right? Mm-hmm. And so any kind of recruitment would have to be sort of like remote and referred to another practice. Now, these are for drug trials, right? Now, certainly when we talk about other clinical trials, right, we do, for example, the gluten challenge, single dose gluten challenge to measure IL-2. And from that standpoint, like, yeah, not only do we recruit patients, but we will also recruit the parents. So that is an opportunity. But a lot of this also depends. If you want to do the trials, it also depends on your comfort with managing adult patients, right? And the comfort of your research institution of doing that.
If I can just add something, I think having that communication between the adult and peds is so important. Because we end up in pediatrics seeing patients, as I mentioned, we see them, till they're 20 plus. And I guess we are selling short if we are not exposing them to some of the trials that are going on in the adult world. So I think as pediatric gastroenterologists, we need to be educated as well, in terms of all the trials that are happening, which sometimes gets to be a little difficult if you don't have an adult colleague across the hallway who can actually educate you on some of those things as well. So, I am lucky in terms of being here in Chicago, but maybe one of the things as I'm listening is building a rapport with a local adult gastroenterology team that may not necessarily be in a big academic center, but having those conversations and maybe getting them involved then where they may not have thought about clinical trials in celiac disease, but getting them involved and then expanding our reach as well. I don't know how easy or how difficult that would be, but something to think about with that. It's not always easy to talk to the adult gastroenterologist, Dawn.
So nice.
I'm kidding. I think there's even within adult GI, there's the patients who are the physicians who are celiac based versus the IBD ones and versus the hepatologists.
But I think to your point too, like I didn't even know there was this community GI group like 2 hours from Nashville that does a bunch of celiac trial or does a bunch of GI trials in general, and they're a private group. And so, I found out through my patients, like, oh, we're going to this private practice in Chattanooga to do clinical trials. They don't provide any advanced celiac care. And so you might not know that in your community, there might actually be people doing clinical trials. So something to think about too.
Yeah,
Because we end up
there is.
thinking just about our academic centers and thinking that we are the only ones who do these. But I think from a pediatric meeting them across the hallway is a good thing to do.
Yeah, there is, for example, there's a big group that recruits a lot of patients down in Colorado Springs, like a couple hours south of us. And so this would be a great resource.
Let's see, do we have any other questions? This is a wonderful discussion, a lot to think about, and I definitely learned a lot. I think that, like Dr. Verma said, in my practice, I get asked often, what kind of drugs are there under development, and this will be a good opportunity to educate, especially older kids and their families, that there will be some opportunities for them as adults to join different studies, for sure. Great. So it looks like we're coming on 157. So I'm just going to go back and share my slide again. So thank you to our speakers today for educating us about clinical trials. Again, this is the information about this, how to claim a CME credit by checking or registering at Boston Children's Hospital CME website and sending a message to their number listed here. So we will have upcoming webinar on June 8th. Our webinar committee, whose names are listed here below. I want to thank all of them for putting these events together. And on June 8th, they will be talking about the best of DDW that just happened a week ago in Chicago, with the emphasis, of course, on what's new and exciting in the field of celiac disease. So be sure to tune in on June 8th for this webinar. And with that, the last slide is a call for our colleagues who are not members of SSCD to join the SSCD because of multitude of ways that the clinicians and researchers can benefit from being a member. And some of the benefits are listed here that include webinars, potential grant applications, mentorship, and research development, and others. So thank you very much for your time, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.